This right here is the cheapest smartphone that you can get from Amazon, and I just used it for an entire weekend as my main primary device, and let me tell you, it was not easy. But let's rewind a bit. So a few weeks back, I was browsing Amazon and I thought, gee, I wonder what the cheapest smartphone is. And there are actually surprisingly a huge selection of very, very affordable options, and then that got the wheels turning in my head, and I thought, I wonder if these are any good. So right then and there, I decided to buy one. Now, I really only had three main criteria for picking the phone that I was going to buy. Firstly, it had to be a smartphone. So I came across this really cheap Nokia phone that I loved the look of, but it's not actually a smartphone, so it wasn't eligible. Secondly, it had to have at least one camera on the back. And then thirdly, it had to be carrier unlocked. So this really cheap Telstra phone that I found, it was not an option. And so with all that in mind, I finally stumbled onto this phone, the Moto G04 by Motorola, which at the time that I purchased it cost 147 Australian dollars, which when converted comes to a grand total of 94 US dollars, which is ridiculously cheap. Now keep in mind, the list of cheap phones available seems to change every other day, so there's probably a different, cheapest smartphone by the time that this video goes live. But with that being said, let's start by unboxing the Moto G04. So the box itself is pretty basic cardboard, which is totally fine. It's just gonna go in the bin anyway. But once it's been opened, we've got the phone itself, which I'll move out of the way for the time being. Then apart from the very basic paperwork, we get a SIM ejector tool and no charger, which I was actually somewhat surprised by. But what is appreciated is that the phone actually comes with a clear case pre-installed, which is lovely. That's just one less thing that we have to worry about buying later on. And then we've got the peel. And with that complete, I put my SIM card into it. I spent a couple of hours setting it up as I would any other phone that I use and review. And then I reluctantly entered the weekend using what is probably the cheapest phone that I've ever used in my life. And even after just 48 hours, I've learned a lot about this phone. So let's start by unpacking everything that I was pleasantly surprised with. Firstly, the design. Now, obviously this thing ain't winning any design awards, but for 90 US dollars, gee, it's not all that bad. Like, it's got this matte finish plastic all the way around the back and the sides of the phone, which means it's virtually immune from fingerprints, and it feels very comfortable in the hand. And even though we've got a pretty sizable chin and a slight forehead on the front, it honestly looks very decent, especially with that hole punch cutout for the selfie camera. Then we've got the software, and if you've ever used a Motorola phone in the past, then you'll know that their phones run a very clean version of Android with just a couple of extra tweaks here and there, and it's the same here even with the cheapest phone that they sell. So you've got this little sidebar that you can set up to quickly launch apps or tools or contact shortcuts. There's this pretty extensive gestures menu in the settings that provides you with a bunch of extra gestures on top of the default Android ones, like using this chop action to launch the flashlight, or double tapping to lock your screen, or using a 3-finger swipe to take a screenshot, and there's a few other options on top of those as well. And even though the software is still running Android 14, which is actually perfectly acceptable for a phone at this price, it does have a fairly recent security patch from January of this year, which I thought was pretty impressive. Although, side note, when first setting up the phone, there were like 5 or 6 updates that I had to install one after the other to actually get to that January patch, so that's just something to keep in mind. The display itself, whilst being an LCD panel, I haven't used an LCD panel on a phone in a long time, so this was definitely a throwback, but it's actually 90 Hertz, can you believe, which I found really surprising given its price. Oh, and the phone not only has a dual SIM card slot, but it also has space for a micro SD card slot, meaning you can increase the storage tenfold, which is super appreciated. And of course, I can't not mention the headphone jack, which you just love to see. The battery life is probably what I describe as somewhat okay, where both days I used the phone, it was hitting a tick above 30% at the end of each day, although that was with relatively light use, so it's definitely nothing to write home about. But my guess is anyone buying this is not a power user, so very much acceptable as far as battery life is concerned. And surprisingly, whilst the lone 16 megapixel rear camera is absolutely not good, it's also not unusable. All right, well, you do need to be in like really, really good conditions to get anything remotely close to looking half decent at best. There's also a lot of shutter lag, so you can't count on it to take images of fast moving objects. Also, video quality is not great either, but you can get serviceable images if need be out of this camera, and that to me was a pleasant surprise for a phone this affordable. Oh, and selfie images are about to be expected too. Not great, but also not unusable. Again, they do a job. All right, then we get to the not so crash hot with this device. And it's really hard to complain all that much when a phone is under $100. So as such, I'm gonna try to keep this brief. So as to be expected, the haptics and the vibration motor are the worst that you will ever get in a phone. To be honest, not that big of a deal. The display has really, really bad viewing angles, but again, not the biggest issue at this price point. This side-mounted fingerprint sensor, whilst in theory I was hoping would be a fantastic budget-friendly compromise, it's actually also really unreliable and pretty frustrating to use, but it does a job. I think the biggest compromise that anyone's going to notice if they were to use this phone themselves is in regards to its performance. It just lags like nobody's business. I mean, not only am I referring to how long it takes for apps to load, but even just swiping and navigating around the OS, it ain't a smooth experience. I will also just flag, during the setup process, honestly, this phone is borderline unusable. It gets warm to the touch, tapping anything takes several seconds to register, and honestly, I was really concerned in those first few hours during the setup process, but once the phone was fully set up with no pending software updates and nothing intensive happening in the background, the performance did level out a bit and become a little bit more reliable. And what I mean by that is that for the most basic of tasks like playing Spelling Bee or Wordle, or even scrolling social media to some extent, obviously sending messages and making phone calls, it's definitely usable for all that sort of stuff. And the thing is, I think those sorts of users are probably who this phone is aimed at. And for anyone who fits that category, you could probably do a lot worse than the Moto G04. That being said, it is worth noting that you can hop online and buy something like a refurbished Pixel 4 XL, which was a flagship phone back in 2019, for less than the Moto G04. And in fact, come to think of it, maybe I should do that myself. But to sum up, yes, I survived the weekend using the cheapest smartphone that you can buy from Amazon. Did I enjoy using it? Absolutely not. Was switching my SIM back to the Xiaomi 15 Ultra one of the biggest reliefs I can think of in recent times? Absolutely yes. But it was a fun experiment nonetheless, and I'm kind of interested to do it with other phones now. Let me know in the comments which phone you reckon I should try switching to for 48 hours next, and subscribe so you don't miss when those videos go live. But aside from that, hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will catch you later.